that working? You got it? I'm going to need this, but I've got to clear me some room. I didn't know whether I was going to be needed for a children's story or not, but then I thought, no, you'll have that worked out because I wasn't going to be here, and then I was going to be here, and I wasn't going to be here, and I wasn't going to. It's been one of those weeks, I can tell you, and I was medicated as well, so there was no excuse. And when I saw Simon here, I'm thinking, oh, that ratbag. He could have told me he was going to be here, and I would have had him preaching. That's probably why he didn't. So, and so, yeah, I didn't know what they're going to tell, but this children's story fits. This is an adult story. This is not a children's story. And in fact, I think some of the kids have probably heard this one because I told this at a regional day. But it fits with this story because I love this sermon title, but I don't like it. And so the title of my sermon is called The Dragon Slayer. The Dragon Slayer. And my story is about a teacher. She was a lady teacher in high school. I went to a fairly big high school. I went from a very small primary school to a very big high school. And I was, I wasn't as I am now. Like, I'm quite happy to be up the front. I love speaking. When I was in school, I didn't like that at all. I was very shy. I was very quiet. I was very naughty, but I wasn't a very boisterous person. Some may disagree, but I was very shy. And coming from where I was only 3 people in a class to now being 30 in a class, and there was 3 classes of 30. So, I mean, there was a huge amount of kids in our school. And when I was in year 10, we had, relief teachers. Teachers that come in. You have them at your school. You have teachers come in. And relief teachers were normally pretty blasé. They didn't care what you did. They were just there just to make sure nobody killed each other and nobody was hurt. And then, where's the work set? But not this one. This lady teacher, she was horrible. She used to make us do things that teachers should not make students do, like homework. It was terrible. Maya, it was shocking. She would make us do homework, maths homework. And not only that, when we walked in the door, she would check that you've done your homework. Oh, shocking days. Shocking days. And then you had punishments for not doing your homework. So I never did any homework. I was always in trouble. This teacher was the worst. Oh man, give us the normal teacher. Get rid of this relief teacher. She was a dragon lady. Oh, nobody liked her. Nobody liked her. Until one day, we had to do sport. We had a sports carnival coming up, and coming from a very small primary school into a bigger high school, there are a lot of sports at a primary school we never ever did. And I was very good at sport. That was the number one. My number one subject at school was sport, next to lunch, in that order. And so we're doing, and you had to do all of the sports. So we had a choice, the teacher, and of course, our class with 30 students, we had to have 2 teachers looking after the sport. When you're dealing with dangerous objects like javelins and shot puts and discus, you couldn't have 30 kids just going loose with these type of weapons. You had to have 2 teachers. And of course, one of our sports teachers away, so we had a relief teacher, the dragon lady. And we had our sports teacher. He was this real muscly, single guy with the big mo, back in the 80s, big mo. He was an Italian guy, just muscle. He was just muscle. He loved doing all sorts of sports, and everybody loved him. All the girls loved him, and all the boys loved him. All the boys wanted to be like him, and all the girls wanted to be with him. He was just, and this relief teacher, she was a single lady as well. And she was a scrawny, she was horrible. When she said you got to do homework, everybody just lost respect. There was just, so she's there as a relief teacher. And so the teacher says, you've got a choice. What are we going to do today? We've got a sports carnival coming up. With a few that we haven't done yet. And I wanted to do javelin because when I was at home, we just loved to throw sticks. Javelin was my thing. Yeah, javelin, let's do javelin. But most of the class said, no, let's do discus. I didn't have a clue. Never done it before. I mean, I'd thrown cow patties around a paddock, but that's as close to throwing a discus as I'd ever got. Picking up a dry patty and throwing it at my brother's. But I'd never done it professionally. And our class was sort of in between, about 15 girls and 15 boys, thereabouts. But they only had a certain amount. And actually, I think we were outnumbered with boys than girls. So we had 16 boys and 14 girls. Boys just outnumbered. But we only had 15 discus. And I was a bit shy. As I said, I was a bit shy. So all the boys went first. None of the girls wanted to have a go first. All the boys went first. So all the boys went and grabbed the discus, and they all lined up on a line. And you had all your rules. They went through the rules. You can't throw if there's somebody in front of you, blah, 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 all this sort of thing. I wasn't listening. But anyway, you had all these rules, and so all the boys lined up, and the teachers were right down the paddock because the boys could throw a really long distance, not to get into the equality thing or anything else, but the girls weren't throwing as far as the boys. So the boys went and they threw their discus, and all the boys, once you threw your discus, the teacher would say, is everybody throwing? Yes, everybody's throwing. Okay, now come down, get your discus, and bring it back and place it on the ground. And so the boys went down, they picked up their discus, they come back, and the teachers would measure the longest ones. The people who threw the longest ones, the teachers would measure it to see how far, so that they could pick out of all of the students which ones would go into the competition. And of course, then all boys, so now, okay, girls, you line up. Oh, and Darryl. So there was all this, so I was with the girls. And so here I am lining up with the girls to throw the discus. And of course, the teachers were down there, and the girls, they weren't going to throw as far. And so the teachers didn't go as far down the paddock. And so they said, okay, girls, now throw your discus. So the girls all threw their discus. And they said, has everybody thrown yet? And they said, no, Darryl hasn't thrown yet. Darryl, why haven't you thrown your discus? You're too close. Darryl, just throw your discus. You're too close. I think I can throw that far. Have you ever thrown a discus before? No. Darryl, throw the discus. You're too close. Darryl, and then he's starting to get cranky, and then the relief teacher, the dragon lady, she turns around and gives me the evil eye. Ooh, started to breathe fire, smoke coming out of her nose. Darryl, throw the discus. Okay then. And then she turns around, so she has her back to me. She's talking to the relief teacher. So I get into the wind-up. So I'm looking. I'm picturing it in my mind. That's how I do things. I'm a spatial person. I've got to picture. If I can picture it in my mind, I can do this. Sylvia, I can do this. Picture it in my mind. What do? They stand there, and then they spin around really fast, and then they let go of the discus. So I'm picturing this in my mind. I can do this. Okay. So I get my wind up. Big deep breaths, wind up, and I get down. Well, I get into this spin. I'm spinning so fast that I start creating a vacuum. There's rubbish starting to draw in, kids starting to feel the pull. I'm spinning so fast. I had this perfect spin. I'm spinning around, and then I let go of the discus. And it's like slow motion. This discus flying through the air. And then people are just, oh, wow. And then there's discus and the teachers. And discus, and then you could see, you could see what was going to happen. And of course then, you're, look out! And just then the relief teacher turns around. And the discus skims off her forehead. Knocks her out cold. She's lying on the ground, out cold. Everybody's in shock. And it was an incredible throw. It was a beautiful throw. She got in the way. And it skims off her forehead. She's now on the ground, and the teacher, his eyes just about popping out of his head. And who threw that? Darryl did. Oh, I didn't know what to do. As you wouldn't know what to do. Well, a part of me wanted to get the tape measure from out of her hand so I could measure the throw. It was so good. And so I probably got an extra 2 or 3 metres off her forehead. It was quite good. I wanted to measure the throw. And everyone's, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so she's starting to come to. Some kids are going up to to get an ambulance or whatever. And, and I said, well, it could have been worse. And the teacher, how could it be worse? I said, we could have been doing javelin. That would have been worse. But I went from being a nobody knew who I was, to now being the dragon slayer. I was recently in that high school, and you go into a high school and you got the pictures of all the high achievers in the school. I was expecting my picture to be up there with the dragon slayer. But it wasn't. Nobody probably remembers now. But the kids in that class remembered. I met a few of them and said, oh, remember you knocking that teacher out? Yeah. Why did I tell that story? Well, there's a story in the Bible about a guy, and he was pretty much a nobody. Nobody knew of him. He was the seventh, or he might have been the eighth. Did he have 7 older brothers? Simon, help me. Did David have 7 older brothers? He was the 8th. Pretty insignificant. He was just a servant. He was just a servant. That's all he was. And but God didn't see just a servant. What God saw in David was something really special. God saw something extraordinary in David that he didn't see in anybody else. The world only saw David as just a shepherd boy, but God saw something else. And when we look at that story, because I love patterns and parallels, Debbie, do I love patterns and parallels? And this, David, when you look at the story of David, do I have my water bottle? Did I bring it up? I'm getting I've had a bit of, I might just get my water bottle. Thank you. David, when you look at the story of David, David is a parallel to Jesus. David is one of the most incredible parallels to Jesus. When you look at the life of David and the life of Jesus, you see the parallel. And I always say in the Bible we have patterns, we have parallels, and we have parables. And parables are the stories, the Old Testament stories, that have a meaning. So there's a spiritual meaning or principle in that story that have spiritual significance, that enlighten us about Jesus and the plan of salvation. So that's what parables do. And Old Testament stories, and it doesn't matter what story they are, sometimes we think parables are a made-up story. Jesus makes up a story and that's a parable. Any story from the Old Testament is a parable. There's a spiritual lesson to be learned from that story about the plan of salvation, about Jesus and his ministry. And when we look at the story of David, there's no exception. In fact, the story of David is one of the best, is one of the greatest. Let's have a look at it. So, open your Bibles to Samuel, the book of Samuel. Now, we've got to get a little bit of context. Where are our kids? Our kids are all gone. So when we look at the story of David, who was David's enemy? Goliath. Who was Goliath? He was a giant. Who else was it? Tell me some more information about Goliath. He was the biggest and the meanest. About 10 feet tall. Sorry? He came from Philistine. Tell me about the Philistines. They were rough and bad people. They were warriors. What else do we know about them? You know, it's really important that we understand, because, see, if David is a parallel to Jesus, that would make Goliath a parallel to Satan. So there would be a lot of information, because a lot of information around David gives us context to Jesus. David was a shepherd. Was Jesus a shepherd? Spiritually, let's think spiritually. David was a physical shepherd. Was Jesus a spiritual shepherd? David was a servant to his brothers. Was Jesus a servant to his brothers? Spiritually. So the context around the characters is really important. So let's look at Goliath. He was a Philistine. What do we know about the Philistines? Well, they were horrible people. They had they worshipped false gods, idols. They were the enemy of God's people. For how long? For how long, and was that significant? They got wiped out in about 600 BC. They faded off the picture after David killed Goliath. So that was the turning point. The killing of Goliath was the turning point. But for a certain amount of years up until then, the Philistines had been a real thorn in their flesh, so to speak. For how many years? And is that time significant? Well, they were about 150 years. Is 150 years a significant number spiritually? We struggle, don't we? I struggle with 150 years. And in fact, this is the third mention of a 150-year time period that has to do with Israel. There's two others that are significant. And the reason they're significant, spiritually significant, is because one of them is mentioned in Revelation chapter 9, which is a huge chapter in Revelation. It mentions 5 months. And 5 months, 30 days in a month, that's 150 days. So 150 in a day for 150 years. So 150 years, they're under attack from the Philistines. And in Revelation, we have this 150-year period. When's the only other time that 150 years as a time frame is used that I'm aware of? There may be more. How long? This is another one of these trick questions. How long was Noah in the ark? How long do you think? Well, it says it rained for 40 days. Bit over a year. A little bit over a year and about a month. That's a long time. But there's a certain time period that's mentioned, and it's 150. In fact, there was 2 lots of 150 when he was in the ark, but 150 because it's separated by, if you understand structures in the Bible, there's a 7-day period when they went into the ark, a 40-day period of rain, a 150-day period of where they were just sitting on the water, where God is protected above the chaos and confusion of what's going on. God's protecting his people. Because remember, there was a promise given to Eve. It was a curse to the devil, but it was a promise to Eve and to Adam. And that was, so when they had sinned in Genesis chapter 3, he said that I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman. Okay, I'm going to put a division between her seed and your seed, and he's going to, can you remember what it says in Genesis 3? He is going to, what's he going to do to his head? It says, is it crush or bruise? Bruise is another one. Bruise, crush is closer, or even some translations cut off. But you're going to bruise his heel. So that he is referring to Jesus. So there, right, the devil, you and your seed are going to be at war with me and my seed, pretty much. That's what it's going to be. You and your seed are going to be at war with my seed. But I'm going to have the victory because your head's going to be cut off, your head's going to be crushed, but you're going to bruise my heel. You're going to bruise Jesus' heel. It's referring to Jesus. The he is Jesus. Jesus is the seed. Paul makes that very clear. Jesus is that seed. And so here we have, so God has this protection upon, because he's got to have a saviour of the world. We've got to have a saviour. What the devil wants to do is destroy God's plan, but God's always got a protection of his plan and his people. And so the ark was that protection. And so from there you come down when you follow God's line, when they were in Egypt. Then what happened in Egypt? Pharaoh was going to destroy them. But no, God has a plan. God then brings them out. And a part of that promise of the 430 years in there, that promise. And so here we have, once again, God's people, and we're at a battle where for 150 years the Philistines, see, when the children of Israel went into Canaan, when they went to take possession of Canaan, there were some people that they were afraid of, that they didn't battle with, that they should have battled with. They should have gotten rid of them, but they didn't because they were afraid. And that was the Philistines. And so the Philistines had it over them. For 150 years, the Philistines had it over them. And it's coming to a climax where you've got them camped. I think it's 1 Samuel chapter 17. We have the story where they're camped. The Israelites are on one mountain, Goliath and the Philistines on another mountain, and they're going to battle in the valley. Who's going to win the battle? Well, for the last 150 years, the Philistines have won every battle. Except for one. Except for one. They won the battle, but they didn't really win the battle. And that's a battle where, and so the beginning of Samuel, let's go there. 1 Samuel chapter 5. And the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. So Israel's battling with the Philistines, and they're losing the battle, and somebody has a bright idea, stupid idea. Let's go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it to the battle, and then we'll have victory. Did they have victory? No, they didn't have victory. They lost, and the Ark got taken back to Philistine. And so, what are we going to do with it? Well, let's put it in our temple with Dagon. Now, what do we know about Dagon? He's a false god. See, the other thing about the Philistines, Dagon is mentioned also in, he's the god that they worshipped in Nineveh. It was known as a fish god. And so they say, well, he was part human, part fish. Not a lot of evidence to suggest that. And in fact, when you read it in here, Dagon has arms and legs. So a bit hard. But the Philistines were known as being the sea people. They came from the sea, which is really significant. They were known as the sea people. They come out of the sea. They battled with Egypt. Now, some say they fought with Egypt. In fact, Ramses III, there's hieroglyphics in Egypt of these sea people coming and battling at a time of Ramses III. Egypt had the victory, but then they say Egypt then put them at the north, that Canaan was a part of Egypt at that time, and they looked after they were sort of to glean anything coming down. Any armies coming to battle with Egypt would have to first get through the Philistines. Some historians say that that's where Egypt had set them up. There are other different views that the Philistines, they conquered that area and they made that area a very fertile plain. No, this is our area and we're not moving. Whichever way you look at it, they're a problem to everybody, especially to Israel. And so now they've got the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in their temple with Dagon, their god. And something happens. And if we have a look in chapter 5, verse 2, it says, and when the Philistines took the ark of God and they brought it into their house of Dagon and set it up by Dagon, and when the people of Ashdod arose early in the morning, there was Dagon fallen face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon and they set him up in place again. So at some time during the night, I don't know, one of the cherubim angels sort of flicked his wing a bit and knocked Dagon face down, facing the ark, facing towards the ark. Ooh, wow. They quickly put him back in place again. Ooh, this is not good. And the next night, it happens again. But this time, when the angel gives him a bit of a kick, He falls to the ground, and what happens? His what? His head's broken. His head's fallen off. And it's interesting when you look at the word, my Bible says his palms were broken. And his feet, or his torso, only his body's left. Oh, is there any significance with that, do you think? His hands were cut off. Yeah, which is it? Yeah. It's really unusual. What is God trying to tell us here? God's trying to communicate something here. Yeah, he's broken. But then what happens when you read in the story, because then all of a sudden tumours and sores break out, people are dying, and they're going, man, we've got to get rid of this ark. And so they're working, what are we going to do with it? And so they decide they're going to put it somewhere else, and then havoc happens there. It's cursing us. This ark is cursing us. And then in the end, they get together, the leaders get together, and they got us, what are we going to do? And it's really interesting what they decide they're going to do. In chapter 6, verse 3, and so they said, if we send away the ark of God of Israel, do not send it empty, but by all means return it to him with a what? With a trespass offering. And this trespass offering is take 5 golden tumors and 5 golden rats. It's a bit odd, Sarah, isn't it? The tumours were of their sores that they had, like a mould of their sores. That's what this golden tumour was. So these tumours that broke out on them, take a gold mould of them, and we're going to offer them. A bit strange. A trespass offering. Have you ever heard of a trespass offering? Do you know there's 5 main offerings that God told the Hebrews to have? Do you know there was 5? 5 main offerings. What were those 5 main offerings? No, they were their feasts. They were their feasts. This is really interesting. I've got to find it here now. I wrote it down. Here it is. There was 5. There was a burnt offering. We all know burnt offerings. That's the offering they put on. There's a burnt offering. They had a sin offering. They had a grain offering, and they had a peace offering. And they had a trespass offering. Israel had a trespass offering. You know what a trespass offering was for? If you committed sin ignorantly, so you didn't know that you were breaking the law, but you've broken the law, but you did it ignorantly, you didn't realise, you would offer a trespass offering, and then that would cover you. It almost lines up with this offering. It almost lines up with this. You know, we didn't realise that we're breaking any law here. We need to send it back, but let's do a trespass. They had their own trespass offering, which is really interesting. Bit of an odd one, and it was 5. 5 tumours, 5 golden rats. Why rats? I've got no idea, but they must have had their reason. And so that's what they would do. And look what it says. This is where it gets really interesting. Sarah, you'll love this. Verse 6. Why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians in Pharaoh hardened their hearts? When he did mighty things among them, they did not let the people go, that they might depart. Now therefore make a new cart, take 2 milk cows, which have never been yoked, and hitch the cows to the cart, and take their calves home away from them, and take the ark and put it on, and send it back. And where does the cart go? It goes back. So here the leader is saying, guys, we don't want to be like the Egyptians. We don't want to be like the Egyptians. Let's not harden our hearts like the Egyptians did. Let's do a trespass offering, their own stupid trespass offering. but let's send it back. They had a respect to God that Pharaoh didn't have. But it's interesting that there was 5, the number 5. It was according to the number of the laws of the Philistines. How many stones did David pick up? 5. See, people say he picked up 5 stones because that was for Goliath and his brothers. Well, yeah, that fits. But I think there's more of a spiritual reason of why David picked up 5. What does the number 5 mean? It means grace. It means grace. Beautiful, Hannah. It means grace. 5 means grace. It's a number of grace. It's the number of grace. Well, hang on. 5 stone number. He's going to knock Goliath's head off. Why 5? Why 5? See, when David went down to battle with Goliath, you know the other interesting thing about Goliath and his brothers. Now, this is not biblical. I've got to be a little bit, I'm telling you this is not biblical. But historians, there are some ancient historians that link Goliath and his brothers, Simon, you'll love this, to a person by the name of Orpah. Aladdin calls her Orpah, but when you look at the name, it's Orpah. And she had a sister-in-law called Ruth. Are you telling me, Pastor, are you trying to tell me? I'm just saying what history has recorded, ancient history, Jewish history, actually has a link between Orpah and Ruth. And when Orpah went back to her people, she got herself mixed up with a lot of fellas, got into some trouble. And out of them come these boys of Gath, Goliath. And so hang on, Ruth had a baby who was the grandfather of Jesse, David. So you're saying that David in some ways connected relationally with Goliath? I mean, that doesn't fit spirit. There's no spiritual connection there, is there? Between Jesus and Satan, is there? Well, hang on. Satan was the most cherished in heaven. The name Lucifer, do you know what the name Lucifer means? Morning star, or better still, light bearer. Lucifer was the light bearer in heaven. Who is the light bearer on earth? Well, Jesus is. Jesus is the light bearer. Jesus is the light of the world. But at some point in heaven, Lucifer was the light bearer. There's a lot of connections between Jesus and Satan. Well, who created Lucifer? Jesus did. Jesus would have created him. He would have been the Son. He would have been a son of God. So a very strong connection. A very strong connection. So it doesn't surprise me at all that between King David and Goliath there's actually a connection. Because in the heavenly realms there's a connection between Jesus and Satan. A very strong connection. It gets better. So here they are battling it out. Goliath's there. And this spells the end for Israel. If they lose this battle, they lose. They're wiped out. This is it. And nobody is stepping up. Nobody is able to step up to fight Goliath. And David says, well, I'll do it. He steps up. No armor, just goes and picks up 5 stones. And with one of those stones, because at the end of the day, what is David protecting? When we look at the big scheme, spiritually, what is David protecting? What's he fighting for? Fighting for what? He's fighting for the house of Israel. So that, for what reason? For what reason? Ultimately, for what reason? What is David fighting to protect? The Messiah. What about the Messiah? What is the Messiah going to do? He's going to sacrifice his life to bring grace and mercy, to give grace and mercy to the world. That's what they're protecting grace. They're protecting the love of God. That's what he's fighting for. That's why he picks up 5 stones. That's why it's going to be 5. He's fighting for grace. And for grace, I'll take, that's my view. My view, he's picking up 5 because he's fighting for grace. This is a grace battle here. Yes?
I'm just having this brain thing. Is there a connection in the way that David killed Goliath, even in the head, which is Satan's bruised head, and Jesus coming and hitting the head?
Just hold on. Just hold on. Hold that thought. It's a good thought. So here David goes in, he picks up 5 stones, puts them in his sling, he throws them around. Goliath is coming at him. Bam, one hits him, fair in the forehead. Does that stone kill him? Knocks him out. What does David then do? Takes Goliath's sword and does what? Chops his head off. Why? Have you ever watched movies? My wife and I, we like watching detective movies. And it always frustrates me. Hannah, I just get so frustrated. But it's a show, okay? It's a show. But I get frustrated. And you'll see, and they'll knock the bad guy out. And he'll be on the ground. And I'm thinking, finish him! Finish him! Finish him! You haven't finished him. And then they're sort of, and the next thing, they got him. Didn't finish him. You'd finish. David wasn't making that mistake. David finished him. And cut off his head. What, just to win the battle? Oh, the symbol of cutting off his head. Because then what did that do to the rest of the Philistines? Whoa! We've lost our head. He's the head. That's, they always say, when you fight a battle, shoot the generals first. Get rid of the generals and the rest will scatter because they won't know what to do. They got the general. He's got the general. The general's down. And then a slaughter happened, mate. They chased those Philistines all the way back to Philistia. Then what did David do? What did David do with that head? He would have put it on a pole. Where? Where did David? Verse 54, 17 verse 54. Read it with me. 17:54, and then David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to, where did he bring it? He brought it to Jerusalem. He took the head. Israel didn't have Jerusalem at the time. It wasn't theirs. The Jebusites had Jerusalem. But David was inspired. Why was he inspired? I believe he was inspired, unbelievably, to take that head of Goliath and put it on. It doesn't say put it on a pole, but history tells us when you fight a battle and you conquer the king, you get his head and you put it on a pole outside the city, their city, as a sign to their people that you have been conquered. As a sign that you have been conquered. But the Jebusites weren't even a part of this battle. The Philistines weren't there. The Jebusites were there. But David was impressed to take this head to Jerusalem. Why was he impressed to take this head to Jerusalem? What's the significance? Physical significance? Not a lot. Not a lot. If he went and took it to the main city of the Philistines, that would have been a good physical sign to the Philistines that you've been conquered. But he didn't. He took it to Jerusalem. Why did he take it to Jerusalem instead of the capital city of the Philistines? He could have taken it to Gath, where Goliath was from. He was from Gath. In fact, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was taken at one point, at Gath, and they put it in the temple there. Get rid of it out of here. That would have been a good place. If you wanted to send a message to the Philistines, that's where you would have taken his head. But David doesn't take his head there. He takes it to Jerusalem instead. What's going through David's head that he would take it to Jerusalem? And put it on a pole and stick it outside. I believe he put it. Some say he probably buried it. That's where it probably had ended up. In fact, archaeologists, even today, are digging up around. So when you go and put it outside of a city, you put it on the highest point. What's the highest point outside Jerusalem? Golgotha. What? Golgotha. What does that name mean? Sorry? Well, this is another name, but what does Golgotha mean? The name Golgotha. What does it mean? Place of the skull. Now, Simon, you've been there, and they'll take you there and they'll say, look at the rock formation. It looks like a skull. Well, physically, yeah, it does. It looks a bit like a skull. And so this must be Golgotha because it's the place of the skull because it looked like a skull. I don't know. Physically, but what about spiritually? David conquered Goliath. David representing Jesus. Goliath representing Satan. And when Jesus was hung on the cross on Golgotha, the place of the skull, who did he defeat? He defeated Satan. So the very battle that David fought, he took the head, cut off the head, and he took it to Golgotha, put it on a pole. But there's no pattern in Scripture where it just doesn't make sense because Goliath on a pole? Why would you put Goliath on a pole when Jesus is going to be put on a pole? Why would you do that? Why would you put Goliath on a pole to represent Jesus being on a pole? I mean, there's no pattern in Scripture where that happens, is there? Is there? Moses and the snake. So that story in Exodus where they're getting bitten by snakes, and for a cure to the being bitten by a snake, you are to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole and lift it up. And Jesus even said to Nicodemus, just as Moses lifted so the Son of Man will be. So is there a pattern in Scripture? Because you always say, why a snake? Why do they make a bronze snake to represent Jesus being lifted up? Oh, hang on, that's a pattern. Why would you put Goliath's head on a pole? Oh, symbolic of sin being put to death. Yeah. Sin being put to death. Because that was the promise that God had made in the Garden of Eden. That sin's head would be, the devil's head would be crushed. Where was Satan's head crushed? On Calvary. It was on Calvary that the devil had lost all of his authority on earth. He was conquered. But it goes on and it says, but he will bruise your heels. Well, see, some point to Calvary and say, oh, well, Jesus had a spike going through his heels. Would have been through his heels on the cross. So that's that being fulfilled on the cross. It's like, that's pretty good. But is it good enough? No, spiritually it's not good enough. And that's why we turn to Ephesians chapter 1. We look at the writings of Paul. How much time have I got? None. Ephesians chapter 1. Verse 22, and talking about Jesus being, we could go back to, I don't know, we'd have to go back a few verses, but talking about Jesus' ascension to the Father. When Jesus died on the cross and ascended to the Father, he then, in verse 22 it says, He put all things under his feet. In fact, Revelation mentions so many times about Jesus when he ascended to the Father and how authority was put under Jesus' feet. And when you have something under your feet, it means it's under your authority. It's under your... And so when Jesus had the victory on the cross, power was taken from the devil because now his head's been cut off and it's now been put under the authority of Jesus' feet. Well, then what about the bruise? Well, even though it's all been put under the feet at the cross of Jesus' authority, does that mean all of humanity then follow Jesus? No. Only those that choose to follow Jesus are under his care. I mean, the whole world is being judged. It's all been judged by God, and in the end, God is going to. But see, that bruising to me is, yeah, but I'm going to lose a lot. Yeah, I've got the victory. I've cut off the head, but there's a lot of my creation I'm going to lose. That's not coming under my authority. They choose not to come under me. And to me, that's a great bruise to the God of all creation. So really that story of David and Goliath is a story of the plan of salvation. It's the story of the cross and how Jesus is going to have victory in the end. So this is what we call a parallel. You see Calvary being played out in David. And that's why David wrote so many beautiful psalms. And in fact, when you read the psalms, you should read the psalms as a prayer from not just David to God, but Jesus to God. Because those prayers are so, you put Jesus in your mind when you read those prayers and you go, wow, that's the prayer of Jesus to God when he was on earth. When Jesus was on earth. Because Jesus became sin for us. That's what Jesus did on the cross. That's why it's Goliath's, the symbol of Goliath's head, because Jesus had to become sin in order to save us from sin. Not that there was any sin. He didn't commit any sin. It's not saying that. But Jesus had to become sin to save us from sin. And that's why you have the snake being lifted up. That's why you have Goliath's head being lifted up. That's why you have the name of the place. Golgotha is the place of the skull, but it's derived from Goliath's name, Goliath from Gath. Very, very significant. And the name Goliath, do you know what the name Goliath means? It means exile. And it also means to uncover and reveal. To uncover and reveal. Oh, see, very significant. And see, when we look at the Revelation, in the book of Revelation, you have so many spiritual parallels when you look at beasts that come up out of the sea. Well, that's the Philistines. The Philistines were a beast to Israel that came up out of the sea that they had to have victory over. And the only way you have victory over the beasts that come up is through the blood of the Lamb. It's your faith in Jesus that gives you the victory. You know, Israel had to put their faith in David. They didn't want to put their faith in David. Israel did not want to put their faith in David. But they had no other choice. He was the only one that's willing to stand up. At the time of Christ, the only one willing to stand up was Jesus. They didn't really accept Jesus. They didn't want Jesus to stand up for them. But Jesus stood up anyway. And he stood up to show grace. The number 5 is, I never realised how common the number 5 is in the Bible. The number 5 is all the way through. I want to finish. 5 is there everywhere. Like you had these 5 main offerings. There's 5 books of the Pentateuch. 5 representing grace. But it also represents, when you have 5,000, it's representative of Israel as a nation. that God shows grace to. And so many more. I challenge you to go and have a look. And those five offerings, those five main offerings, is just amazing. And in this story, we see how through an amazing story, we tell it as kids' stories, and yeah, it's really good. It shows how God was with David. But we really need to read these stories. We need to see Jesus in the story, not how Jesus is influencing the story, but how Jesus is in the story, and how these stories are parallels to the plan of salvation. And they become so much more richer. They become so much more alive, and things are drawn out, and you go, oh, wow. And how God's plan of salvation, and when you see it in these stories, the plan of salvation, you go, that's physically impossible. That's physically impossible. That you have so many of these stories that you can see the plan of salvation. You see the cross in these. You see God just pouring out his love and grace upon humanity, upon his people through these stories. And you go, wow, they become just so special. And David is one of those special people that God said, yes, it's going to be a good example. People will see the plan of salvation. They'll see Jesus in David. See Jesus in the person, living and breathing and working within the person. And that's what we need to see today too. Let's look for Jesus within the person. The living, breathing people that are in our communities, that are in our church. Instead of seeing all the... Because you can see the bad in David. Plenty of bad in David. David made some pretty bad mistakes. If you want to see the bad, you'll see bad in David. But don't look for the bad. You learn from the bad, but you look for Jesus in the person. And that's my challenge for us. When we read these stories, let's look for Jesus in the story, but as we mingle with people in our communities, let's look for Jesus in the people and see the plan of salvation and grace being poured out upon them. Let's have a prayer. Father in heaven, we just want to thank you for these incredible stories in the Bible and how you are the dragon slayer. Lord, you didn't really, it wasn't your plan and purpose for the world to be this way, but unfortunately it is what it is. But right from the foundation you had a plan that you were to come and to tackle the darkness in this world head on. And you were tackling it head on with the wonderful gift of grace and mercy that you bestow upon us. And Father, continue to pour out your love, please, in and through us and into our communities as our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.